One of the most bloodthirsty and psychotic warmongers to occupy high office in Washington resigned today, evidently and hopefully bringing a shameful end to her long and destructive career in Washington. Victoria Nuland, who worked for every American president from Bill Clinton to Joe Biden, with the sole exception that she was out of power only during the Trump presidency, announced today that she was resigning her position as acting Deputy Secretary of State, a position to which she had just been promoted last July when the prior Deputy Secretary of State retired. There's much speculation about why Nuland may have resigned now. Perhaps it was due to her anger that the Biden administration is not doing more to fuel the war in Ukraine against Russia, one of her pet projects for decades, though the Biden administration is impeded only because Congress, under House Speaker Mike Johnson, won't approve another $60 billion for that war. Perhaps it is anger over the fact that the Biden White House is now tepidly criticizing Israel, a country to which she is more devoted than almost anybody in Washington. Or perhaps, and most likely, it was due to the fact that she was just passed over to permanently become the Deputy Secretary of State, the position second in line to ascend to her lifelong ambition of becoming Secretary of State. Whatever the reasons, and despite the horror show that has already replaced her, someone who also worked for Dick Cheney and has been around the State Department for decades, there is still much to celebrate from this news of the end, at least for now, of Victoria Nuland's career in government. She served as Dick Cheney's top advisor for his disastrous invasion and occupation of Iraq. She then served as U.S. ambassador to NATO when the Bush administration, led by Condoleezza Rice and Victoria Nuland, began attempts to expand NATO right up to the Russian border, including Ukraine. And one can draw a direct line between that expansionist mentality in 2007 and 8 and the decade-long war in Ukraine now taking place. She then ran Ukraine for the Obama administrations under Hillary Clinton and John Kerry, where she became one of the most extremist voices in Washington for placing the U.S. on a confrontational, provocative course with Russia. And then when Joe Biden replaced Donald Trump, one of the first things he did was immediately hire her to run Ukraine for his administration. In 2014, a conversation that Nuland had with the then U.S. ambassador to Ukraine was tape recorded and leaked, allegedly by Russia, in which the pair were caught plotting who should be chosen to rule Ukraine, who was best for the United States, in the wake of the U.S.-supported coup in 2014 that succeeded in removing Ukraine's democratically elected president. While Nuland, in one sense, is merely one of the most extremist representations of the bipartisan machine of endless war that has ruled D.C. for decades at the expense of ordinary Americans, she is also a singular menace and ghoul. Nuland's pedigree is itself revealing. She married into the largest and most toxic neocon dynastic family. In the 1990s, she married Robert Kagan, who for decades was the principal partner of Supreme neocon Bill Kristol, having worked with him in the 1990s to create the leading neocon group Americans for a New Century, which spent years before 9/11 urging the U.S. government to invade Iraq and remove its government. According to Politico, which named the couple among the top 50 most powerful people in Washington in 2014, Nuland and Kagan, quote, fell in love talking about democracy and the role of America in the world on one of their first dates, end quote. That is neocon speak for invading foreign countries and changing their governments. Kagan's father, his brother, and his sister-in-law are all leading neocons in Washington, always sending other people's families to fight in one war after the next after they architect and sell those wars to the American public while never fighting in any of them themselves. Nuland's status as both a singular force for war and destruction, and her status is one of the most vivid symbols of how bipartisan and insulated from elections is this warmongering ideology, makes her particularly worthy of examination, especially upon her glorious resignation, the final end to her bloodthirsty reign. Understanding her trajectory is vital to understanding how Washington really functions. Last August, we produced a comprehensive look at the rotted life and bloodthirsty value system and warmongering obsession that Victoria Nuland has pursued and implemented for decades under the rule of both political parties. Given that we have an audience composed of many people who are recent arrivals in the last several months, and given that her departure is really a momentous occasion to take a look at what she did, we will show you that report we prepared last August as it is more relevant now than ever upon her departure. Elected officials who wield a lot of power in Washington do sometimes receive a fair amount of media attention, but oftentimes the people who wield real power in Washington, the ones who aren't accountable to the democratic process, who stay in power regardless of which political party you vote for, get far too little attention given how much influence they wield. And that is definitely the case for Joe Biden's new Deputy Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, who has been occupying crucial positions in the U.S. government going all the way back to the Clinton administration, through the Bush administration, through the Obama administration, skipping over Donald Trump, and now wielding more power than ever, especially over Ukraine and the war in Ukraine under Joe Biden. She really deserves a lot more attention than she's received. So let's look at, first of all, at one of my favorite British reporting outlets, which is Responsible Statecraft. When Victoria Nuland was reported in on July 25, they said the following, quote, "Uber Russia hawk Victoria Nuland rises to acting Deputy Secretary of State. She's done as much as anyone to sour U.S.-Russia ties. Now she is one of Washington's top diplomats." Quote, "In a little remarked move, the Biden administration announced Monday that Victoria Nuland will take over as the acting second-in-command at the State Department. She replaces Wendy Sherman, who plans to retire at the end of this week. Nuland's appointment will be a boon for Russia hawks who want to turn up the heat on the Kremlin. But for those who favor a negotiated end to the conflict in Ukraine, a promotion for the notoriously, quote, undiplomatic diplomat will be a bitter pill. When Nuland was serving in the Obama administration, she had a now infamous leak call with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. As the maiden uprising rolled the country, the pair of American diplomats discussed conversations with opposition leaders, and Nuland expressed support for putting Yatsenyuk into power. Yatsenyuk would become prime minister later that month after Russian-friendly former President Yanukovych fled the country. At one more memorable point in the call, Nuland said, "Fuck the EU," in response to Europe's softer stance on the protests. Nuland, along with the State Department's sanctions czar Daniel Fried, then led the effort to punish Putin through sanctions. Another official at State reportedly asked Fried if, quote, "the Russians realize that the two hardest-line people in the entire U.S. government are now in a position to go after them." Nuland's hawkish inclinations continued after she left the Obama administration. Back in 2020, she penned a foreign affairs essay entitled, quote, "Pinning Down Putin," in which she called for a permanent expansion of NATO bases in the alliance's eastern flank, a move that would be sure to ratchet up tensions between the United States and Russia. As I previously noted, Nuland also opposed the idea of a, quote, "free rollover of New START," the only remaining agreement that limits Washington and Moscow's nuclear weapons stockpile, and as it was set to expire in 2021. Now, what I always found most remarkable about Victoria Nuland's thriving inside Democratic Party administrations such as Barack Obama's and Jill Biden's, where she's clearly one of the most powerful people in the State Department, given portfolios of Russia, where she's a fanatical neocon and hawk, and then the war in Ukraine, where she's as fanatical as anybody in Washington, is that she played a key role in the policy that Washington and corporate media supposedly regards as the most strategically misguided and the most morally unjust of any policy in the last 30 years, which is the U.S. invasion of Iraq. She wasn't just in the Bush administration. She was directly at the side of Dick Cheney. She was Dick Cheney's key advisor, not in general, but on the question of the Iraq war. She helped him advocate for that war. She helped implement the war. And then she helped him govern Iraq after the invasion was complete and the insurgency dragged on for many years. Here is Victoria Nuland, just to give you a sense for how long she's been around Washington, how integral she was to not just the Bush administration, but Dick Cheney with regard to Iraq. When you watch a C-SPAN interview in 2006, at this point, she was the U.S. ambassador to NATO under the Bush administration. And here's what she had to say about her work with Dick Cheney.
And sometimes it's simply a matter of taking an administration or a group of people who have strong political support but don't know how to make the sausage inside a government and implementing what it is that they want to do.
You worked for the vice president what years?
2003 to 2005. So those first years when we were on the ground in Iraq, also got the enormously exciting experience to work with him when some of the colored revolutions were going on, the Orange Revolution.
Oh, wow. She got to work with Dick Cheney as these colored revolutions took place. Where did they take place, Victoria Nuland?
In Ukraine, and then the Lebanese Revolution. So that was very, very exciting as well.
NATO before and NATO afterwards. What's the difference, by the way, from being the
So you can see how excited she was even back then about regime change efforts in places like Ukraine and Lebanon, the color revolutions, as they were so inspiringly called, in order to make them seem like there was something to celebrate. Who doesn't love color? They're like rainbows. They're beautiful. They're inspiring. They make us happy. She was happy. Now, the fact that she was U.S. ambassador to NATO under the Bush administration may be even more significant. She was Dick Cheney's key advisor with the war in Iraq, because NATO at the time was being pushed by key neoconservatives and hawks as the key to American power into the future. There were a lot of even Europeans suggesting that maybe NATO doesn't have viability anymore, given that the whole purpose of it was to protect Western Europe from a country that no longer exists, which is the Soviet Union. That is something Donald Trump was saying in 2016, which is one of the things that made the U.S. security state so hostile toward him. But she certainly wasn't saying that. She was a fanatical booster of NATO. And remember, it was in this second term of the Bush administration when there was really active consideration for expanding NATO up to the Russian border to include Ukraine. That was when the current CIA director, Bill Burns, wrote a letter to Condoleezza Rice warning her, because she too was a Russian expert and in favor of doing that. He warned Condoleezza Rice that it's not just Vladimir Putin, but essentially everybody in Russia, including Putin's liberal opponents, that regard membership in NATO for Ukraine to be a red line, to be so provocative that Russia would have to consider that to be a grave threat to their country. And he warned that any attempt to expand NATO up to the Russian border, especially if it were to include Ukraine, would almost certainly provoke a war in the Donbass and with Crimea. People knew in Washington that that's exactly what happened, and yet there was Victoria Nuland, as she was celebrating the color revolutions, including in Ukraine, obviously a cheerleader for the regime change operation in Iraq, also as the U.S. ambassador to NATO, pushing for NATO to expand and for it specifically to expand up to the Russian border, which of course a lot of people in Washington knew at the time that if you tried to do, it would have provoked exactly the war that we now have, the one in Ukraine. Here is an article from 2005 on how many people in Washington who were neocons and warmongers were trying to turn NATO into the key weapon for future U.S. wars. There you see the title, NATO, U.S. sees global training role as key to transformation. And it reads, quote, a better equipped, better funded, and more flexible NATO is one of the central foreign policy goals of U.S. President George W. Bush during his second term. In the words of the new U.S. ambassador at NATO, Victoria Nuland, the U.S. wants the alliance, quote, retooled for the 21st century. The United States has in recent months indicated it wants NATO's next summit to discuss transforming the alliance. She said the United States has already begun talks with allies on how it would like to see NATO change. She said a key U.S. wish is to turn NATO into the world's, quote, multilateral security trainer of first resort. Quote, we think NATO has huge untapped potential as a security trainer, Nuland said. The United States and many other allies are committing a lot of resources nationally to meet the training needs of lots of our partners. The U.S. and France, for example, are now working with Lebanon to strengthen its security services. We believe that NATO can do more of this collectively, as we have started to do in our training center for the Iraqis. How much better is it to train others to manage their own security than to have to send troops in a crisis? More traditional concerns also feature on the U.S. wish list. Nuland said Washington wants the NATO Response Force, NRF, scheduled to become fully operational in October to become more deployable, modern, and responsive. Nuland said the NRF must be given capabilities to meet threats, quote, wherever and whenever they may arise. Quote, if the divisive debate over Iraq taught us one thing, this is her and the lesson she drew from the, quote, divisive debate in Iraq, it is that NATO must be the place where we talk about the issues, all the issues affecting our future. The Middle East, Iraq, North Korea, China, Iran, just to name a few, U.S. Ambassador to NATO Victoria Nuland said. Now remember, the context there was that neocons were furious that they couldn't get the invasion of Iraq approved by the UN or by the UN Security Council. France and Germany were adamantly opposed, as of course were China and Russia. And the lesson Victoria Nuland drew is we have to leave aside the UN or any other parts of the international community and use NATO as the only weapon or vehicle for fighting the wars we want to fight. And when it came time for the Obama administration, at the time she was working for Hillary Clinton, and it was time for the regime change war in Libya, and Obama was opposed to it, and Hillary Clinton, Samantha Power, took the key lead in advocating that Obama join that war. They did it through NATO. Because, of course, the UN was never going to approve a war, an unprovoked war in Libya. That was the vision she was working on in the second term of the Bush administration after she had already gotten done invading Iraq. Quote, Nuland's comments indirectly rebut a suggestion earlier this year by German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, who said NATO had lost its relevance as the primary venue for transatlantic discussion. German politicians later noted that the alliance fails to discuss many of the most pressing global issues. Nuland said Afghanistan will remain NATO's most important mission for the foreseeable future. She said the NATO-led ISAF stabilization force will by next spring extend its activities to the south of the country. Just imagine you are one of the leading advocates for the war in Iraq, promising that there's all the success in the war in Afghanistan, and then demanding NATO be expanded into Eastern Europe up to the border, including Ukraine, and be used as a tool for regime change operations, including in Libya. You have all these bloody disasters on your plate. And American public opinion is against all of them. You would think somebody's reputation and credibility in Washington would be crippled as a result of advocating so many destructive policies that resulted in the deaths of so many people unnecessarily for reasons that completely backfired on American interests as they were defined at the time. But that's not how Washington works, ever. Jeffrey Goldberg got caught spreading crucial lies using the pages of The New Yorker, promoting the idea that Saddam Hussein was in alliance with al-Qaeda, which led 70% of Americans to conclude that Saddam Hussein had participated in the 9/11 attacks, which got them to justify and support the invasion of Iraq. He got journalism awards for spreading that lie on behalf of the U.S. security state. And as we know, he now occupies the position of editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. And he also just got promoted by having a PBS show given to him that has long been called Washington Week. So he's advanced. The more he's lied, the more bloody wars Victoria Nuland is involving herself in and advocating and cheering and justifying, the more she advances in bipartisan Washington. It doesn't matter. You could have gone to the polls in 2008 and voted for John McCain. You could have gone to the polls and voted for Barack Obama. And Victoria Nuland would have ended up running things for the State Department. Not only despite all these things she did, but precisely because of them. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.